I'm so glad to have you with us for this online course in the spirituality of St. Francis de Sales. It's a special joy for me to share this spirituality because it has been so formative in my own life. It has been an important part of shaping my theology, my ministry, and my own life of prayer. What I will do in the course is post very brief online lectures that will follow the readings that you're doing, and I'll try in the lectures to give you some frameworks, some things to think about, highlight things that I wouldn't want you to miss in some of the reading that you're doing. And then at the end of each of the lectures, I'll suggest a question, and you can post an answer to the question on the course forum page. And you can post your own thoughts, and I also encourage you to respond to what others post. That way we can make this online course also a conversation. Francis de Sales was born in 1567 and died in 1622. This was, in a sense, the heyday of spirituality. So much was being written. De Sales was educated by Jesuits, and so you will notice a great deal of Ignatian influence in what he writes. He was also someone who revered the writings of Teresa of Avila, and you will notice her influence in the more contemplative parts of what he writes and in his approach to prayer. De Sales was Bishop of Geneva, but because of the Reformation, he was not actually able to reside in Geneva. He only went there one time, and it was secretively. He lived instead in Annecy, which is a part of France very close to Geneva, in a part of the world that was then called the Savoy. He was well known as a bishop. He was also a spiritual director. Interestingly, he was spiritual director to many lay people, lay women in particular, which for the time was unusual. He was the author of two very important works, the Introduction to the Devout Life, which is really a compilation of his letters of spiritual direction, and also the Treatise on the Love of God, which is a more theological work, and it's been called a work of mystical theology, in the sense that it is not a theology that is primarily based in Scripture, although the influence of Scripture is certainly there, not primarily based in the work of the patristics, although some of that is also there. It is a theology that comes from his own experience of God, from his own relationship with God, which makes it unique, and it is why people refer to it as a work of mystical theology. We will be mining that work, not only for his experience of God, but also for the systematic theology that underlies it. Some of the major themes that you will notice in this spirituality: first of all, optimism, in two senses. First of all, de Sales has a very optimistic image of God. It is an image of God that is loving and inviting. This is a God who is not harsh and punitive, but a God who reaches out to us, who desires to be in relationship with us. It is also an optimistic view of the human person. De Sales believed in the fundamental goodness of the human person. Yes, that has been weakened by sin, but it is never completely extinguished. He believed in the universal call to holiness, that holiness, which he called devotion, is something that is open to each and every one of us, no matter what our state in life. He believed that God is at work everywhere, in all aspects of life. This, of course, reflects some of his Jesuit influence. But he believed that the spiritual life is not something separate and apart from the rest of our human life, but an integral part of all of it. He believed that spirituality is an affair of the heart. You will notice language that is very affective. The word heart, the image of the heart, is used throughout. It is a dynamic image and a dynamic view of spirituality. When he uses the word heart, he's not talking about a two-dimensional image or something that is just about emotion. He's talking about that part of the human person where the will, the intellect, and the emotions all come together. It is the central dynamic of the human person, and it is there, he believed, that God speaks. And God speaks in a way that brings about subtle movements of the heart. So the language of God is a movement of the heart. DeSales thinks about love as something that is also a dynamic force, not just a feeling, but he says that love is the king of all movements of the heart. It turns all things toward itself and causes us to be like what we love. Love is a dynamic force. It moves us. It changes us. It moves us toward union with what we love. Discernment is an important theme in Salesian spirituality as it is in Ignatian spirituality. We'll talk about this more when we read the treatise on the love of God. But DeSales believed that there are many different ways in which we come to know the will of God. Broadly speaking, two ways. One that he called the signified will of God. All of the things that we've learned from Scripture, from the commandments, even from the inspirations that God gives us. The other way that we learn about the will of God is what he called the will of God's good pleasure, the circumstances of our lives, also part of the language of God to which we need to yield. He was sensitive to the fact that often we find ourselves caught in a tension between the two, caught between what it is we know we should do and desire to do, and what the circumstances of our lives allow us to do. The disposition of the heart with which he believed we should approach discernment, he called holy indifference. Not indifference in the sense of apathy or, oh, whatever, but indifference in the sense of being completely open to what it is God is calling us to do. To want to do God's will simply because it is God's will. But more about that as we approach the treatise on the love of God. Devotion is a word that DeSales used not in the sense that we tend to use it now. We tend to think of devotion as more external practices. But he believed that devotion was something that was both interior and exterior. He said genuine devotion is true love of God. When divine love adorns the soul, it is called grace. Inasmuch as it strengthens us to do good, it is called charity. When it has reached such a degree of perfection that it makes us do good carefully, frequently, and promptly, it is called devotion. More about that as we read the introduction to the devout life. But it is a way of thinking about holiness that is both deeply interior and necessarily exterior. It can't be just one or the other. Holiness calls us to a deep integrity of life, where the inside matches the outside. Humility is a very important Salesian virtue. And He does not use humility in any of the negative ways that we may think about it. It certainly has nothing to do with humiliation or a lack of self-esteem or a lack of appreciation of our own gifts. Humility for DeSales was about truth. The truth of our goodness, our giftedness, the fact that we are made in God's image, and also the truth that we don't always live up to that. Humility is something that keeps us from taking offense when we are slighted. He writes that if we are proud, puffed up, and enraged, when we are stung and bitten by detractors and enemies, it is a sure sign that in us neither humility nor meekness is genuine and sincere, but only apparent and artificial. Humility is not a weakness, it is a great strength, and it is an ability to see the truth, the deep truth of who we are. Gentleness is sometimes called the premier Silesian virtue. It is a complex thing to describe. Even the translation is difficult. DeSales, of course, wrote in French, and he used the word douceur, which we might translate sweetness. But it would be a poor translation for us today because he didn't mean by that anything saccharine. He meant a sense of proportion, of perspective, an ability to treat the other person and ourselves with a deep, profound respect. This quote from the introduction to the Devout Life gives you some idea of what it is he's talking about. When your mind is tranquil and without any cause for anger, build up a stock of meekness and mildness. Speak all your words and do all your actions, whether little or great, in the mildest way you can. Gentleness is really a deep inner peace. It is a sense of equanimity. DeSales is paraphrased as having said, "Be who you are and be that well." This actually comes from one of his letters of spiritual direction, where he wrote, "Don't sow your desires in someone else's garden. Just cultivate your own as best you can. Don't long to be other than what you are, but desire to be thoroughly what you are." This is an indication of the goodness and the respect with which he approached each individual, and with which he encourages us to approach our own spiritual life.